Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remove that. The voice was young. It was sharp, brittle, and coated in the unearned confidence of a man who had only ever read the rules but never understood their purpose. Silas Kane did not move. His eyes, the color of a faded sky, remained fixed on the polished wood of the witness stand across the sterile military courtroom. He was not on trial. He was merely here to watch, a ghost in the gallery, present for the grandson of a fallen friend. The young officer, a Marine lieutenant with a name tag that read Davies, stepped closer. His uniform was so crisp it seemed to crackle with each movement. His shoes were mirrors. His posture was a testament to the rigors of Quantico. Sir, Lieutenant Davies repeated, his voice louder now, attracting glances from the board clerks and a few spectators. Your decoration. It's not authorized for wear in a federal court-martial proceeding. It's a violation of decorum. Silas's gaze drifted down to his own chest. Pinned to the lapel of his worn, simple tweed jacket was not a medal. Not really. It was a small, dark object, crudely shaped like a star. It was forged from pitted, blackened metal, with 5 uneven points and a small, dull piece of red glass pressed into its center. It looked like something a child might make in a workshop. It looked cheap. It looked fake. It is not a decoration, Silas said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a deep river. The lieutenant's lip curled into a smirk. It was a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. Right. And I'm the commandant, he scoffed. Look, Grandpa, I don't have time for games. Take it off, or I'll have you removed. The word grandpa hung in the air, a deliberate barb meant to diminish and dismiss. From the bench, the presiding judge, a Navy captain named Wallace with a perpetually sour expression, looked over his spectacles. What is the issue, Lieutenant? Civilian contempt of protocol, Captain, Davies announced, his chest puffing out slightly. This individual is wearing an unauthorized, and frankly, sir, what appears to be a counterfeit medal in your courtroom. It's an insult to the uniform and to these proceedings. Captain Wallace squinted at the old man. He saw a stooped figure, weathered hands resting on a simple wooden cane. He saw thin, white hair and a jacket that had seen better decades. He saw the strange, ugly piece of metal pinned to it. He saw nothing of importance. He's right, old-timer, the captain said, his tone dismissive. He gestured with a pen. This is a place of military discipline. We don't have time for costume jewelry. Remove it. A low chuckle escaped the judge's lips. It was a dry, grating sound. He actually laughed. He laughed at the old man's fake medal. Silas felt a familiar stillness settle over him. It was not peace. It was the calm of a deep, cold ocean, the kind that existed just before the storm broke. He had felt it in the frozen hills of Korea, in the humid jungles of a place no one remembered, and in the quiet moments between impossible orders. I cannot, Silas said, his voice unchanging. The lieutenant's face flushed with anger. This was defiance. This was a direct challenge to his authority, to the uniform he wore, to the very order of this room. That's it, Davies snapped, reaching forward. I'm taking it. His fingers, clean and manicured, brushed against the rough fabric of Silas's jacket. They closed around the crude metal star. The touch was a spark on dry tinder. The sterile, air-conditioned courtroom vanished. He was no longer Silas Kane, an old man in a quiet gallery. He was Ghost. The world was screaming. The air tasted of cordite and iron. It was cold. A deep, biting cold that froze the oil in a rifle and the blood in a man's veins. He was huddled behind the frozen carcass of a jeep, the metal so cold it burned his skin through his gloves. General Merritt was beside him, bleeding from a dozen shrapnel wounds, his breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. The radio was dead, shattered. Its gears and wires spilled out onto the snow like metallic entrails. They were cut off. The entire division was about to be overrun, a ghost in the storm, because the call for air support couldn't be made. It's no good, Ghost. The general had coughed, blood speckling his lips. We're done. Silas, then a young man with old eyes, had said nothing. He had simply pulled the broken radio toward him. With numb fingers, he began to work, salvaging wires, bypassing shattered circuits, using the blade of his knife as a crude conductor. It was impossible. The radio was a corpse. Hours passed. Or maybe it was minutes. Time had frozen along with everything else. Then, a crackle, a whisper of static. He had done it. He had raised the dead. He made the call. He saved them all. As the first friendly aircraft screamed overhead, General Merritt had grabbed a shattered gear from the radio's casing. It was a 5-pointed cog, blackened by the explosion. With the last of his strength, he had pressed a shard of red glass from a broken taillight into its center. "They don't make medals for this kind of thing, son," the general had whispered, his life fading. He pressed the makeshift star into Silas's hand. "But you never forget what you did here. You never let them forget." The memory faded. The roar of engines was replaced by the hum of the courtroom's ventilation. Lieutenant Davies's fingers were still on the star. "Let go," Silas said. The words were not a request. They were a command, delivered with a weight that made the air grow thick and heavy. The quiet old man was gone. For a fleeting second, Davies saw something in those faded blue eyes, a flicker of a fire that could melt steel. The lieutenant recoiled as if burned. He took a half-step back, confused and unsettled. In the back of the courtroom, a gunnery sergeant named Miles watched the entire exchange. He was older than Davies, with the quiet competence of a man who had seen real conflict. He didn't know the old man, but he knew the type. He had seen that same unnerving stillness in grizzled operators in Fallujah and Sanjin. It was the stillness of men who had become so familiar with chaos that peace was the only thing that felt strange. He saw the lieutenant's arrogance. He heard the judge's mocking laughter, and a knot of unease tightened in his gut. This was wrong. All of it. Protocol was one thing. Disrespecting an old man who carried himself like a monument was another. And that medal, it wasn't shiny. It wasn't polished. It looked like it had been through hell, which, to Gunnery Sergeant Miles, made it more real than any ribbon on a rack. He quietly slipped out of his seat. He walked with no urgency to the courtroom doors, pushed them open, and stepped into the hallway. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call the base commander. He called a number he wasn't supposed to have, a direct line to the aide of the fleet admiral himself, a man he had served under years ago. The aide, a brisk commander, answered on the second ring. "Commander Allen." "Sir, it's Gunnery Sergeant Miles. I'm over at the JAG building, courtroom 4-inch. I'm busy, Gunny." "What is it?" The commander's voice was impatient. "Sir, there's an old man here. A civilian. Lieutenant Davies is trying to eject him for wearing some kind of non-regulation piece on his jacket. And this requires my attention. Why?" The commander sighed. "Sir," Miles said, lowering his voice, "it's the way he carries himself. And this thing on his coat, it's a dark metal star, 5 points, looks like a broken gear. It's got a piece of red glass in the middle." Dead silence. The silence stretched for 1 second. 2. 3. When the commander's voice returned, it was completely transformed. The annoyance was gone, replaced by a tone of absolute, ice-cold urgency. "Gunnery Sergeant, what is the civilian's name? I heard the bailiff say it when he checked in." "Kane. Silas Kane." A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. A muffled curse. The sound of a chair scraping violently against a floor. "Keep him there," the commander ordered, his voice now strained, almost panicked. "Do not, I repeat, do not let that lieutenant lay a hand on him. I don't care what you have to do. Stall them. The Admiral is on his way. God help us all. The Admiral is on his way." The line went dead. Gunnery Sergeant Miles stared at his phone. He had expected a reprimand for wasting a commander's time. He had not expected sheer, unadulterated terror. He turned and hurried back into the courtroom. Inside, things had escalated. "I am giving you one final order, sir," Captain Wallace boomed from the bench, his face purple with indignation. "Remove that object, or Lieutenant Davies will remove you from my courtroom in handcuffs." Davies puffed up, placing his hand on his sidearm for dramatic effect. He was enjoying this. He was enforcing the rules. He was the agent of order against this stubborn, delusional old man. "It stays," Silas said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Fine," the judge roared. "Lieutenant, escort Mr. Kane out, and cite him for contempt." Davies grinned and stepped forward, reaching for Silas's arm. It was then that the doors to the courtroom burst open. They did not swing. They were thrown, slamming against the walls with a sound like a thunderclap. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Framed in the doorway stood a man who seemed to suck all the air from the room. He was tall and lean, wearing the immaculate uniform of a four-star admiral. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. On his uniform jacket were rows upon rows of legitimate, hard-won ribbons, culminating in the Navy Cross. This was Admiral Jonathan Thorne, commander of the entire Pacific Fleet. Behind him, 2 aides and a phalanx of stone-faced Marines stood at attention. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound it was deafening. The ticking of a wall clock sounded like hammer blows. Captain Wallace shot to his feet, his jaw slack with shock. "Admiral, we were not expecting you, sir." Lieutenant Davies froze mid-stride, his hand hovering inches from Silas's arm. He snapped to attention so fast he nearly lost his balance. Admiral Thorne's eyes, chips of blue ice, swept the room. They passed over the stammering judge and the terrified lieutenant as if they were furniture. His gaze locked onto the stooped figure in the gallery, and his entire demeanor changed. The cold fury melted away, replaced by something else entirely. All reverence, a deep, profound respect that bordered on worship. He strode forward, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He walked past the judge's bench without a glance. He walked past the quivering Lieutenant Davies. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of the old man in the tweed jacket. For a moment, he just stood there, his gaze fixed on the crude metal star. A flicker of raw emotion crossed his face. Then, Admiral Jonathan Thorne, a man who commanded fleets and answered only to the president, drew himself up to his full height. He brought his right hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, so utterly perfect, it seemed to cut the air. He held it there, his arm trembling slightly with the force of his conviction. "Mr. Kane," the Admiral's voice boomed, thick with emotion, filling every corner of the silent courtroom. "It is an honor, sir." Silas Kane slowly, deliberately, gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The Admiral lowered his hand, but did not move. He turned his head just enough to pin Lieutenant Davies with a glare so venomous it could have curdled milk. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "What, precisely, were you doing?" Davies swallowed hard, his face pale as a sheet. "Sir, I was enforcing courtroom decorum. The civilian, he was wearing an unauthorized." "An unauthorized what, Lieutenant?" the Admiral hissed. "You thought that was a medal?" "Yes, sir. It appeared to be a fake, sir." "An insult. An insult." The Admiral took a step closer to the young officer. "You stand there in your pristine uniform, which you have never seen tested in real fire, and you dare to speak of insults." He pointed a trembling finger at the object on Silas's chest. "You think that is a fake medal? You think a man like this needs to fake anything? That, Lieutenant, is the Ghost Star. It is more valuable than every medal in this room combined, including my own." He turned to address the entire, stunned courtroom. His voice rose, becoming a declamation, a history lesson delivered with the force of a battering ram. "Let me tell you who you have been threatening. Let me tell you who this judge saw fit to laugh at." He gestured to Silas. "This is Silas Kane. To most of you, he is nobody. But to the survivors of the chosen reservoir, he is known only as the Ghost. In the winter of 1950, when the 1st Marine Division was cut off, surrounded, and facing annihilation at the hands of 10 Chinese divisions, this man, then a 20-year-old radio operator, did the impossible." The Admiral's voice resonated with history, with a story he clearly held sacred. When his command post was overrun and his general was dying, when their only radio was smashed to pieces in sub-zero temperatures, he rebuilt it. He rebuilt it with frozen hands, under enemy fire, using scrap wire and his own ingenuity. He got a call out. A single call that coordinated the air support that punched a hole in the Chinese encirclement, allowing thousands of Marines to fight their way out. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He refused the Medal of Honor. He refused all commendations. He said he was just doing his job. When the dying general gave him that piece of the radio that saved them all, he took it and vanished. He became a ghost. For 70 years, the Marine Corps has been searching for him, just to say thank you. The Admiral's gaze fell upon Captain Wallace, the judge, who looked as if he was about to faint. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You laughed at him." He turned back to the petrified Lieutenant Davies. "You, who have never known a day of real hardship, tried to put your hands on a living legend. You mistook his quiet humility for weakness. You saw his age and assumed frailty. You disgraced your uniform today, Lieutenant. You disgraced the very ideals it is supposed to represent. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence of shame, of shock, and of sudden, profound understanding. Gunnery Sergeant Miles, standing by the door, felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to his eyes. He had been right. Silas Kane finally moved. He reached up and placed a gentle hand on the Admiral's rigid arm. "Jonathan," he said softly. The boy was just following the rules he was taught. The Admiral looked at Silas, his fury instantly dissolving into deference. "He showed you no respect, Silas." "Respect is not a rule," the old man said, his gaze shifting to the ashen-faced lieutenant. "It is a lesson, and lessons are often learned the hard way." Admiral Thorne stared at the young officer for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He turned to Captain Wallace. "As of this moment, this court is in recess indefinitely," he commanded. "And you, Captain, along with your lieutenant, will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. You are both being enrolled in a new mandatory course of instruction for all officers at this command. It will cover the history of this service and the meaning of humility." He paused, then added with cold precision, "We're calling it the Kane Protocol." The consequence was delivered. Not a discharge, not a demotion, but something far worse for men of ego, a formal, institutionalized reminder of their failure, named after the man they had wronged. Months passed. The story of what happened in Courtroom 4 became a quiet legend on the base. Lieutenant Davies was no longer the arrogant, strutting officer. The experience had broken him down and rebuilt him into something quieter, more thoughtful. He took the Kane Protocol seriously, spending hours in the base library, reading about the chosen reservoir, about the forgotten heroes who wore no medals. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, he was sitting in that same library, a dusty history book open in his lap. He looked up as the door opened, and his heart stopped. Silas Kane walked in, leaning on his cane. He moved slowly to a shelf, selected a book on gardening, and sat down at a table not far from Davies. For 20 minutes, the former lieutenant sat there, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do. He closed his book, stood up, and walked over to the old man's table. Silas looked up, his faded blue eyes showing no surprise, no anger, only a quiet patience. "Mr. Kane," Davies began, his voice barely a whisper. He stood ramrod straight, but there was no arrogance in his posture now, only a deep, humbling shame. "Sir, I wanted to apologize for my conduct in the courtroom. There is no excuse for my ignorance or for the disrespect I showed you. I am truly, deeply sorry." He said the words and meant every one of them. Silas Kane looked at the young man for a long moment. He saw the change in him, the hollowed-out pride, replaced by a nascent wisdom. He gave a slow nod. "The uniform does not make the man, son," Silas said, his voice as calm as ever. "The man makes the uniform. You've learned that now." He offered a small, knowing smile. "That is all the apology I need." With those words, the weight of a monumental failure lifted from the young man's shoulders, replaced by the simple, profound grace of a quiet hero. The lesson was complete.